is generative AI going to transform everything? I figured I'll ask GenAI, what do you really think about it? And GenAI seems to be cautiously optimistic. We are expecting somewhere around 17 to 25 trillion with a T dollar of annual impact as a result of AI in general. And off of that, about 1/3 of that impact is going to come from GenAI. These products, when put out in production and commercially, they come with a risk on potential liability, potential IP infringement, potential risk around or like the governance issues or regulatory frameworks that are kind of developing. Potential side and challenges side on bringing this technology to value. And we have started seeing a whole lot of advancement that are happening in generative AI. And the first question that comes to mind is, okay, why is it different, right? I mean, we have been doing AI for a whole long time. The first question, how many of us has tried ChatGPT or DALL-E or something? Okay, beautiful. So I don't have to, I'm preaching to the choir here. One of the main things that we have seen is a whole lot of neural network models or deep learning models that we were doing essentially, they are on steroids now, right? So scale comes with a whole lot of advantages. It comes with a whole lot of new characteristics of the system. We started with like the systems where they were designed for a purpose, and we are in a setup where we are starting to studying the systems because we don't really have a good understanding of what all they can do, right? So it's like a paradigm shift. We are also kind of engaging with the systems in a different way. It's very human-like engagement. There are continuous engagements that we can essentially do with the systems, and they're not like one-offs. They're not giving you like point predictions anymore, right? They are engaging with you. So that's sort of a fundamental UX change that essentially happened here. And because of that UX change, your prediction engines are seemingly generating content. And that is sort of like the core idea behind GenAI to say, okay, I moved from systems that were essentially just giving me classification or outputs or this, that, or the other, and they can give me something much more coherent. And not just that, I can kind of generalize them across the board, basically, right? Here's sort of a simple example. I figured, okay, you know, everybody says, is generative AI going to transform everything? I figured I'll ask GenAI, what do you really think about it? And GenAI seems to be cautiously optimistic. But look at the response, right? It's sort of very well coherent response. It's very human-like. It cites resources. It tells me where that information is essentially coming from. So this is sort of a question that I really pose to Bing, right? So it's like a semi-production system rather than a ChatGPT, which is sort of a more free-flowing system. Same thing's happening on kind of text to images. So I put like a prompt in Bing's image generator. Just tell me or create me an image of a person playing with like 2 dogs and a cat in a park across the India Gate. It's getting a lot of context out of it, right? It understands what India Gate typically refers to. It gets it right. It gets the park part right. It adds like a whole lot of animals to it. Adds person to it. So it looks pretty impressive actually, right? And that's sort of a whole lot of this content generation that is being created now that is generating crazy amounts of excitement. The query that I put earlier gave me sort of citation to this resource as well. This is where kind of a whole lot of, you can call it optimism, you can call it exuberance, a whole lot of it is coming around, right? But on the right side, basically, this is an estimate coming out of McKinsey report. They say, we are expecting somewhere around 17 to 25 trillion with a T dollar of annual impact as a result of AI in general. And off of that, about 1/3 of that impact is going to come from GenAI, right? So it's like very, very large estimates they are putting in. Are we able to realize it? We don't really have a timeline around it, right? And that's the part that we need to understand well on how exactly to go from promise to actually action. Before that, let's just see, I mean, these are like probably the areas that you are most familiar with, right? A whole lot of what we like to call foundational models coming in. Models trained at extremely large scales, models with billions of parameters, if not more, models that are trained on practically all of entire internet scale data. And those are essentially creating a whole lot of different behaviors. So we are still building what we used to build in the past. We are building a prediction engine which takes on a whole lot of words and basically predicts the next set of words, except that now we can do it at scale and we can do it in bulk, right? There is a continuity that we can really build into the system. And not just that, we are going from one modality to different modalities as well. So like the example that you saw, I can take a text prompt and I can basically create an image out of it. So there's like a lot of developments that are happening on this fundamental foundational model side. And in parallel, there are a lot of developments that are happening which are essentially on making them work from a technological perspective. So we are looking at like model adaptations, right? How do I really add more context to this model? How do I, for example, make this model work for a specific domain? How do I make sure that there is infrastructure and scaling issues that are addressed, right? I mean, I want to be resource conscious here. I mean, these are extremely, extremely heavy model when it comes to infrastructure. And how do I really build applications? So we are coming up with sort of new ways of doing ML ops, new ways of doing AI ops, right? Essentially, so there is like a whole lot of work that's happening on the tech stack side of it, right? In terms of like the initial success points, we started seeing some consumer APIs coming out of it, some consumer wrappers created around it, ChatGPT being one of them, right? So your core foundational model was GPT-4, GPT-3, and ChatGPT is like a wrapper that allows you to interact with that model. And look at kind of the adoption, right? This is sort of mind-blowing. If I were to compare to other apps, we got to 100 million users in less than 2 months. So this is immensely powerful in terms of how traction it is getting, and mainly because it's a natural user interface. I don't really have to learn how to use this thing. I can just kind of have a discussion with it, right? All of that is good. This is sort of very, very, very nice and very encouraging. What's happening though? Let's compare it to kind of incumbent apps. So if I were to kind of compare it to kind of your YouTubes, TikToks, Instagrams of the world, here's the problem. Your 1 month retention is not as high, right? So people are coming in hordes, but then they're not sticking around, right? After a month, you are like, okay, fine, like the excitement has died down. What the heck do I do with this now, right? Same thing, even worse numbers we are seeing on DAU, MAU numbers, right? So these are like your active, engaged users on a daily or monthly basis, and the numbers are sort of extremely low. Right, so you typically have like an industry median of what, 50%? You are at like 40-odd%, right? Fundamentally, there is something missing here. What's missing now is we have seen that we have very good technology proof points, right? We see massive amount of news coming out to say, look, I mean, you know, the models can do this, that, or the other. There are like X, Y, Z potentials of this model, but most of it are essentially done in kind of lab experiments, settings, or controlled experiments. The question is, how do you really go from there to creating a viable, actionable use case or actionable business out of it? And at least in my perspective, there are like these 2 things that need to be worked out. The first is, who are you helping with and with what problem, right? So if I look at ChatGPT, it's very nice to talk to what problem is it solving for me, right? If I compare it to, let's say, even Instagram Reels, is it doing a socially useful purpose? That's a separate discussion. But there are like a whole lot of things that are entertaining to me. There is like an entertainment purpose that it serves, for example, right? ChatGPT is not there yet. And those are some of the other apps. It's exactly the same issue. You can see how you can create content, but to what end? So fundamentally, there is like a whole issue around product and value, what we are generating, and the same thing translates to other industries now. So if I'm running like a manufacturing company, what is in it for me? I don't really do anything with text. I don't really care about like this image generation, this, that, or the other. How do I really get value out of it? So that is like this other kind of unknown that we are kind of working through as a group. And the second is business model. As of today, Microsoft is losing, so GitHub Copilot is sort of a very, very successful capability that came out. There is huge adoption. For that to be used by users, Microsoft is losing at the very minimum $20 per user per month, right? OpenAI is putting in about $700K a month to essentially just run ChatGPT for a whole lot of this query support, right? So it takes a lot of resources, and you need to figure out what kind of applications would make it worthwhile either to invest those resources or you innovate out to make sure that these resource consciousness is kind of built into the product. So those are 2 things that we broadly have to figure out. And once we do that, we'll have a better understanding of how GenAI fits within the AI and business strategy. So again, it's an important point. GenAI is not replacing all of your AI strategies, right? So fundamentally, it's like how does it really complement what I want to achieve as an organization, right? Both internally as well as externally, right? To get there, one of the fundamental things for any technology that I kind of go about is there is a potential side of it, so we need to understand in different ways how it can be used, and then there is a challenge side of it, right? I mean, we have to understand what it is capable of doing and what of it is wishful thinking, at least as of today, right? So let's start with that potential argument. Here's like the conventional wisdom on it, right? Fundamentally, 2 things happening. We create a lot of foundational models. One of the ways to use that is just create kind of, a direct utilization model, something like, via APIs. Or create a consumer app that is wrapper around it. So fundamentally, the way I kind of like to call it is, give me a problem and let me chat GPT that for you, right? So ultimately, I'm just putting the model as a wrapper, and somehow you'll really try to find a use for it, or essentially augment it the way kind of Bing is doing to say, okay, fine. I mean, in the back end, I'll basically utilize it in some way to give me more context. The second of kind of this conventional wisdom is use it in domain-specific manner, right? So these are like general models, and by definition, that generality comes at a cost in terms of precision and accuracy. So let's try to kind of either shrink this model down, fine-tune this model, really train them or nudge these models for specific use cases on specific domains, right? Harvey is doing it for legal, for example. We talked about Copilot. There are happening it on the code side, right? So just off of these two models, there are like a whole lot of this array of envisioned use cases that are coming out. Content creation, drafting, summarization, you can do meeting notes, you can do creative design workflows. Adobe has already put out like some of these capabilities out in the market now to, test like this market. So there is like a lot of work going on broadly in that space. And then the customer service. Now, if you really think about it, if I have an industrial organization, what does it mean for me? These are all from a core R&D or ER&D perspective. A lot of time it feels like, look, I mean, these are like external facing pieces that I am doing either for customer acquisition, customer support, or basically, push out like my marketing or sales content. So external touch points, right? A lot of it really feels like that. Unless you are like a pure play data, information, or entertainment company, it's kind of not very clear on what do we do with GenAI now. And that's the part I wanted to I was hoping to expand out in terms of understanding of GenAI for additional set of use cases. And here's how I kind of think of it, right? There are three broad buckets. One, there is a lot of work that we are doing with existing applications that are generating significant value for us. Think of recommendations engine. Think of, your planning engines, this, that, and the other. There's like a lot of work happening in those areas. GenAI can really inform the system and make them better. There is like a really good use case for that to happen. There are existing applications, for example, where you are trying to solve very hard problems with AI, and those are the areas where I believe GenAI can really improve your existing applications. And finally, GenAI in and of itself is not an end, right? It can be a means, it can be a partner technology to relatively more challenging problems that you're solving, right? I mean, and I'll run through a couple of very quick examples to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, right? Let's start with that, robot training. If you're familiar with like any industrial robots, right, they are, or like even kind of companion robots, it's kind of extremely difficult to train these robots. I mean, they're typically always trained on robot action data. So you need like a whole lot of history on what all robot did in response to something around it, right? But you can't really kind of repurpose this robot either. So if I am running a robot on the assembly line that's doing essentially binning, I want to repurpose this model to, for example, sorting. It's a completely different problem, and I have to kind of go and retrain this robot, right? So fundamentally, there's a whole lot of robot action data that really gets kind of utilized in it, and there are like an array of machine learning capabilities that say, look, I mean, I can do it through reinforcement learning, I can do it through supervised learning, I can kind of essentially adapt it with user interaction, this, that, and the other. But fundamentally, it's like a non-trivial problem to solve. How does like GenAI act as a partner technology here? Here's where you start seeing like big difference, right? Don't worry about like the density of the slide, it's very dense. Fundamentally, on the right side, you will see these problems, right? I can ask a robot to say, look, I mean, put the strawberry into the correct bowl. Robot doesn't understand what the heck it means, right? It needs to understand what a strawberry is, what a bowl is, what put means. It needs to process a lot of these things. And there are language pieces, there are vision pieces, there are a whole lot of these pieces that really need to come together for the robot to take that action. And it's kind of very difficult to make it happen. This is where kind of one of these capabilities that has been released by Google's DeepMind, as their RT2, they have like an advanced version after that that has recently been released as well. And this is where kind of your large language model starts coming into play. You take a whole lot of kind of this internet scale virtual question answering data, right? So there's like a whole lot of data that's out in the internet that just looks at the picture and says, you know what, just describe it for me, right? What's happening in the image? A gray donkey is walking down the street. I mean, that's like a description of the image, and you take like an internet scale data and push it out to large language models, and they can essentially create inferences, context out of this. Now you have to marry it with what all, the robot needs to understand, and how does the robot process? So you have to make sure that, robot cannot just really do wild things. You still have to contain that space. And those are the areas where you have like this vision transformer. These are like the technologies that are training these robots to essentially constrain their actions. If I combine those two things, right, like your classical robot action data, training your model on what the robot can and cannot do, but open up the space on all the things that robot understand in response to which it can take those actions, right? That is game changing, basically. Here's like a quick example, right? I mean, if for any other robot, if I were to give this example, I need to hammer or nail. What object from the desk do I really use for that? There is no hammer on the desk, right? So now the robot has to do a whole lot of semantic processing to understand, look, I mean, here's sort of, an object that looks like a hammer. It can really do the job. It identifies the rock, it picks it up, and it kind of gives it to you, right? This is sort of a very, very complex action on the robot side, but you can generalize this action across the board now. So there is like significant promise that comes out of it. And as a result of that, of course, a whole lot of range of use cases, right? From all the way from not just industrial automation and this, that, and the other, but you can also program software agents exactly in the same way. So we are not talking about just hardware robots anymore. Here's another example. In industrial cases, you might have seen like a whole lot of areas where you have very, very limited data, right? If I'm doing fault detection, there are not very many faults happening. So what do I model? If I'm really doing failure prediction, exactly the same problem. And one of the techniques that sort of machine learning AI folks have been utilizing in the past is let's generate synthetic data. I can't really get a lot of real world data. I can't really go and crash out a lot of things, whether it's for medical purposes or for industrial purposes, right? Let's start creating synthetic data. And this is where kind of GenAI has been helping. Even before the current wave, right, the GANs, the generative adversarial networks, have been kind of helping with generating this synthetic data that have been improving models for us. And this is like some of the work that potentially, started about like 6, 7, 8 years back, right? It's not even recent. And you start seeing sort of like these not very high quality images, but they help improve your model significantly. But now, with sort of like the new theory and everything else, what you can do is you can do much better, right? So you can have innovation on top of that, and if you see the quality of the images on the right, it's very, very remarkably better compared to this model. And again, I'm taking like visual images just as an example. There are like similar things you can do with non-visual data. That's essentially where like the power of these techniques come. So fundamentally, I mean, if I were to bed better theory with it, it goes a long way. And you can see significant improvement boost, right? I mean, we got like roughly around 50% improvement boost from this new method. What that translates into is you potentially have an algorithm in the lab, and that can essentially translate out to potential production, right? Those are like the fundamental changes that GenAI adoption can really make or kind of move the needle in terms of like the existing applications. And here's sort of a whole lot of list of use case from automotive use cases where we applied it in the past, all the way to kind of, looking into, for example, digital twins in a whole lot of industries, right? Just two examples of what can really happen here. But there are no free lunches. It's a complex technology. It comes with its own challenges, right? And here's an example. So I started asking it, right? Okay, how do I balance a sphere on the edge of a cube? This is like a interaction session with ChatGPT. Free flow engine. It gave me like a very nice looking response, right? So response is good. It looks very nice. Look at the response. What it's saying me is practically kind of insulting, right? It says, okay, take a cube, take a ball or sphere, put it on the cube, and just try balancing it until, it works. It takes a lot of practice and patience. So it's like, okay, hit and try. How do I really go about that? I mean, so this is not like a useful response. And there is like a whole lot of these challenges that you would see in applications where your data is generated, but it may not be meaningful. And those are the guardrails that we need to essentially put around it. Here's an interesting thing. We saw this picture, right? I asked it to create this picture with 2 dogs and 1 cat. Not a single picture really got like those numbers right. This is a problem. You are creating a prediction model. You have a model that is predicting the text. It's not really well designed to do numerical or mathematical pieces yet, right? I'm not saying it won't happen, but currently, as of today, it doesn't exist. Let's take a random image, expand it out. You have a dog that seems to have 3 legs in the front. The cat has a very, very weird anatomic position. I have no idea how cat managed to do that without the leg in the back. The person's hands have like very, very scary fingers, right? There is a lot going on here, and that's problematic, right? So in the first glance, the pictures look good, but eventually, this is what it is. If you are putting it in production, what it translates into is risk. Liability for the product, what are the kind of implications in terms of when the product goes out? And fundamentally mitigating that is tricky, right? So if I look at, for example, ChatGPT, they say, look, I mean, I'm not sure if this problem is solvable. Let me give you a citation, except that it gives me a reference, which is not the right reference, right? It's asking me to put a sphere in the cube, not on the cube. And it got the context wrong. If I were to do image generation, here's this other problem. I asked Bing to create a generative AI apocalypse image, and they have no idea what this content would look like. It might be threatening, it might be just illegal, it can be anything. The only way you can build guardrail around it is, hey, I'm not going to show you the results. can I really scale system like this? No, I mean, you need a significant amount of effort to really go there. I'm aware that my time is off. This is the last slide I wanted to leave you with. Just to understand, it makes sense to be very realistic about this technology and understand kind of its constraints and limitations from a technology perspective. On the business side, you have to have a purpose before kind of you apply this technology. I know there are like a lot of companies that I advise, there are a lot of stakeholders that I take, there are a lot of investment firms that I talk to who are extremely keen in investing like tens of millions to potentially hundreds of millions in these startups coming out. And I don't really see that. I don't really see the business side of it. I don't understand exactly how you take this technology proof point all the way to an actionable product. And that becomes a problem. And fundamentally, you need to understand the risk. These products, when put out in production and commercially, they come with a risk on potential liability, potential IP infringement, potential risk around or like the governance issues or regulatory frameworks that are kind of developing. One thing that I'm urging everybody that I talk to is, it's a technology with immense potential, but we have to be very realistic, we have to be very conscious in terms of how we essentially push it out to generate or extract value out of it. I just leave you with this. Hopefully, this was not too traumatizing. I was the only person between you and the food. I'm around for questions. I'm happy to take questions here if we need to, but I'm around after that if you're interested. Thank you so much.
For more content on tech and leadership, subscribe to NASScom YouTube channel and press the bell icon to never miss an update.